Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, tell me, do you prefer listening with candlelight, a soft lamp, or in the gentle glow of the screen? Share how you set the mood for your evenings. I truly enjoy reading your comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. The New Age Intruder. The fog came rolling in from the sea like a living thing, thick as sheep's wool and twice as cold. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of his Croft House police station and watched it swallow the village of Loch whole, erasing the whitewashed cottages one by one until even the church spire vanished into the grey murk. Hamish was a tall, thin man with hazel eyes and flaming red hair that no amount of regulation gel could quite tame. He turned back inside where his dog Lugs, a mongrel with an absurd fringe of fur obscuring his eyes, thumped his tail hopefully against the flagstone floor. "No walk in this weather," Hamish told him firmly. "We'd be lost before we reached the harbour." Sonsi, his wildcat, merely yawned from her position on the rug before the peat fire, revealing impressive fangs. She had the good sense that only cats possess, which was to stay exactly where she was when the weather turned foul. Hamish had planned a peaceful afternoon. There were sheep to tend in the back field, though the fog might delay that. There was paperwork to avoid doing. There was a comfortable chair and a cup of strong tea waiting. In short, it was shaping up to be a perfectly ordinary day in Lochdew, which was exactly how Hamish Macbeth preferred his days. The trouble arrived at 2:30 in the form of a Range Rover so new and expensive it looked obscene on the narrow Highland roads. Hamish heard it before he saw it, the engine's purr cutting through the muffled silence of the fog. Then the vehicle appeared like a ghost ship emerging from the mist, pulling up outside the Lochdew Hotel with an aggressive spray of gravel. The man who emerged wore the kind of outdoor clothing that cost more than most villagers earned in a month. Waxed jacket from some London boutique, pristine Wellington boots that had never seen actual mud, and a silk scarf knotted just so around his neck. He was in his late 40s, with the sort of tan that came from expensive holidays rather than honest work, and he surveyed the village with the expression of a man who had just purchased something he already regretted. Hamish's instincts, honed by years of peaceful policing, began to prickle with unease. By evening the entire village knew about Julian Vane. News in Lochdew travelled faster than midges in summer, and considerably more persistently. Hamish learned the full scope of the disaster while standing at the bar of the Lochdew Hotel, nursing a dram and listening to the rising tide of outrage. "He's bought the standing stones," Archie McLean announced, his fisherman's face red with fury and whiskey. "The whole bleeding lot. The land around them, anyway." "Language, Archie," his wife snapped from across the room, and Archie hunched his shoulders like a man expecting incoming fire. "Aye, well, it's a bleeding disgrace is what it is," Archie muttered into his glass. The man himself sat at a corner table, holding court like some sort of spiritual guru, which Hamish supposed was exactly what he fancied himself to be. Julian Vane had a voice that carried, loud and plummy and absolutely assured of its own importance. "The standing stones have been neglected for far too long," Vane was saying to anyone who would listen, which at the moment was precisely no one, though he didn't seem to notice. Tremendous spiritual energy in those stones. Tremendous. I plan to harness that energy, create a proper retreat centre. Crystal healing spa, meditation workshops, the works. The seekers from all over the world will come here. "Over my dead body," someone muttered from the direction of the bar. "There'll be an admission charge, naturally," Vane continued, warming to his theme. "Can't have every Tom, Dick and Harry trampling about. Sacred ground requires proper management. I'm thinking of fencing it off next week." The silence that fell was not the peaceful Highland silence that Hamish loved. This was the silence of a village collectively holding its breath before the storm broke. Hamish sighed into his whiskey. So much for a quiet life. Mr. Vane, he said, setting down his glass and approaching the man's table with the careful tread of someone approaching a potentially explosive device. I'm Police Constable Macbeth. Perhaps we should have a wee chat about those stones. What's to chat about? Vane looked up at him with eyes as cold as the fog outside. I've purchased the land legally. All the paperwork's in order. I've checked with solicitors in Strathbane. Nothing you or anyone else can do about it. The stones have been part of this village for thousands of years, Hamish said mildly. The locals are a wee bit attached to them. Then the locals should have bought the land themselves, shouldn't they? Vane smiled, showing very white teeth. But they didn't. I did. Progress Constable. Can't stand in the way of progress. Before Hamish could respond, a soft voice intervened from behind him. Perhaps I could offer you some tea, Mr. Vane. The atmosphere in here seems to be getting rather heated. Hamish turned to find Mrs. Mary Campbell standing there with a tray bearing a proper teapot and cups. Mary was a widow in her early 50s, a sweet-faced woman who did traditional weaving and volunteered at the village heritage centre. She had the sort of gentle manner that could calm the roughest waters. How thoughtful, Vane said, though his tone suggested he found it beneath him. Though I prefer coffee. I'll fetch some, Mary said with infinite patience, as if dealing with a fractious child. She moved through the hostile crowd like a dove among eagles, offering tea, patting shoulders, murmuring soothing words. By the time she left the hotel an hour later, the villagers had retreated to muttering rather than outright threats, and Vane sat alone at his table, oblivious to the danger he'd created. Hamish found Mary waiting for him outside the police station when he returned home through the fog. She held a basket covered with a tea towel. I thought you might like some fresh scones, Constable, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Baked them this afternoon. The evenings are getting so cold. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Campbell. Hamish accepted the basket gratefully. The scones were still warm, and the smell of them made his stomach rumble. That poor man, Mary said softly, shaking her head. I don't think he realises how much he's upset people. Someone should warn him. I tried, Hamish said. Well? Mary smiled her gentle smile. Perhaps things will look better in the morning. They usually do, don't they? Hamish watched her disappear into the fog, a small, kind figure swallowed by the darkness. Then he went inside to share the scones with Lugs and Sonsie, unaware that by morning Julian Vane would be beyond all warnings, and the peaceful life he treasured would be shattered like glass upon the ancient stones. Chapter 2. A Sacrificial Discovery. Hamish woke to the sound of screaming. It was not the sort of sound one expects in Lochdoub at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. It was not the cry of gulls or the bleat of sheep or even the wail of Mrs. McLean berating her husband for some imagined transgression. This was a scream of pure terror, and it came from the direction of the standing stones. He was out of bed and into his trousers in seconds, pulling on his pullover as he ran. Lugs bounded after him, barking frantically, while Sonsie watched from the window with the supreme indifference of a cat who knows that human emergencies are rarely worth the bother. The fog had lifted slightly during the night, leaving the world draped in a thin, ghostly veil. Hamish's long legs carried him up the hill path at a run, his breath misting in the frigid air. He could hear voices now, rising in a confused babble somewhere ahead. The standing stones loomed out of the mist like ancient sentinels. There were 7 of them, weathered grey pillars that had stood for thousands of years, arranged in a rough circle on the hilltop overlooking the loch. Local legend claimed they were the petrified remains of giants who had danced on the Sabbath and been punished by God, though Hamish had always thought that said more about Highland theology than history. A small crowd had already gathered, kept back by the stones themselves as if by an invisible barrier. The Curry sisters clutched each other, their identical faces pale with shock. Archie McLean stood with his cap in his hands, looking like he might be sick. The Reverend Wellington had his arm around young Mrs. and Douglas, who was sobbing into her handkerchief. At the centre of the stone circle, sprawled in a position that no living man could manage, lay Julian Vane, Hamish pushed through the onlookers and stopped at the edge of the circle. Even from here, he could see that Vane was well past any help a Highland constable could provide. The man lay on his back, arms spread wide, his expensive jacket dark with what looked like dew but almost certainly wasn't. His head was turned at an unnatural angle, and there was a depression in his skull that made Hamish's stomach turn. Beside the body, still gleaming with moisture, lay an antique cast-iron peat cutter. Hamish recognised it immediately. It had been part of the heritage display at the village library. A brutal-looking tool with a long handle and a heavy blade designed for cutting through compressed peat. It was the sort of implement that could do terrible damage in the wrong hands. "Nobody touch anything," Hamish said sharply, his voice cutting through the murmurs. And everybody stepped back. This is a crime scene. He pulled out his mobile and dialed Strathbane, all the while studying the scene with a growing sense of unease. The body had been positioned, he realised, not just fallen, but arranged. Vane's arms were spread precisely, his legs straight, his head oriented toward the largest of the standing stones. Around the body, the earth had been recently disturbed, showing signs of frantic digging in several spots. "Is he dead?" Mrs. Douglas quavered from behind him. "Very dead," Hamish said grimly. Who found him?" "I did." Archie McLean's voice was hoarse. "Was coming up to check my sheep, wasn't I? Saw him lying there and thought he'd taken a fall. Then I got closer and saw—" He trailed off, looking green. "Anyone else been up here this morning?" A chorus of no's answered him. Hamish moved carefully around the perimeter of the stone circle, keeping well back from the body. The ground was soft from the fog, and he could see boot prints in the mud, large and deep. There were also marks that might have been made by someone dragging something heavy. Or someone. The wail of a siren announced the arrival of reinforcements from Strathbane. Hamish sighed. He had hoped for perhaps an hour to examine the scene properly before the circus arrived, but apparently that was too much to ask. Detective Chief Inspector Blair heaved himself out of the police car like a whale breaching. He was a fat man with a red face and a perpetual expression of belligerence, made worse by a fondness for whiskey that started earlier in the day than was strictly professional. Behind him came Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, tall and lanky with a drinker's nose, and a younger detective constable whose name Hamish could never remember. "Right then, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, wheezing from the short climb up the hill. "What have we got?" "Murder," Hamish said quietly. "Julian Vane, the man who bought the land around the stones. Someone's caved in his skull with that old peat cutter." Blair's eyes lit up with an unpleasant gleam. A murder in Lochdoub meant headlines, and headlines meant glory for the detective who solved it. Never mind that Hamish had solved most of the serious crimes in the area for years. Blair had a genius for claiming credit. "Suspicious death? Possibly murder," Blair corrected pompously. "We'll let the experts determine that, shall we? Now then, I'll need statements from everyone here. Anderson, get the forensics team up here. You, Macbeth, keep these yokels from contaminating my crime scene any further." Hamish bit back the observation that it was technically his crime scene, seeing as it was in his patch. Experience had taught him that arguing with Blair was like arguing with a stone wall, only less productive and considerably more unpleasant. He turned his attention back to the crowd, which had swelled now to include most of the village. News travelled fast in Lochdoub, particularly when it involved death and scandal. Mrs. Mary Campbell appeared at his elbow, moving so quietly he hadn't heard her approach. She carried a large thermos and a stack of paper cups. "I thought the detectives might appreciate some hot coffee," she said softly. "It's dreadfully cold up here." "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Campbell." Hamish watched as she moved toward Blair's team, offering refreshment with her characteristic gentle courtesy. "Terrible thing," she murmured, returning to his side after Blair had grunted something that might have been thanks. "Simply terrible. Who would do such a thing?" "That's what we aim to find out." Mary reached into her handbag and produced a folded piece of paper. "I made a list last night," she said, her voice apologetic. "After that unpleasantness at the hotel, Mr. Vane was quite aggressive with several people. I thought it might be helpful to remember exactly who he threatened with those legal notices." Hamish took the paper, impressed despite himself. The list was neatly written in careful handwriting, with names, times, and brief descriptions of each confrontation. It was exactly the sort of organised information that could save hours of investigation. "This is very helpful indeed, Mrs. Campbell, very thorough," she smiled sadly. "I do try to be useful. Poor Mr. Vane. Whatever his faults, he didn't deserve this." Blair was shouting orders now, sending the young detective constable to string up police tape, barking at the forensics photographer to get better angles. Anderson caught Hamish's eye and rolled his own in a gesture of shared suffering. "Macbeth," Blair's bellow cut across the hilltop. "Oh, stop standing about like a scarecrow and get these people's names and addresses. I want to know exactly who had a reason to want this man dead." "That would be most of the village," Hamish said mildly. "Then you'd better get started, hadn't you?" Blair smirked, clearly pleased with himself. As the morning wore on, the standing stones became the centre of intense activity. The forensics team arrived with their cases and cameras. The police surgeon made his preliminary examination and pronounced what everyone already knew, that Julian Vane was deceased and had been for several hours. The body was photographed from every angle, the ground searched, and every boot print carefully documented. Hamish watched it all with a growing conviction that something was deeply wrong about the scene. The positioning of the body, the ritualistic precision of it, the choice of weapon from the village's own heritage collection. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion. This was something planned, something personal, something that spoke of old grievances and carefully nursed rage. He looked at Mary Campbell's list again, at the neat handwriting and helpful details. She really was remarkably organised, he thought. Almost too organised. But that was ridiculous. Mary Campbell was as gentle as they came, a soft-spoken widow who made tea and baked scones and wouldn't harm a fly. Still, as his grandmother used to say, still waters run deep. And sometimes, Hamish thought, watching the sun finally burn through the morning fog, the quietest people had the loudest secrets. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. By late afternoon, Blair had set up what he grandly called his incident room in the back parlour of the Loch Dubh Hotel. Hamish, who had been relegated to the role of glorified errand boy, was fetching yet another pot of coffee when he decided enough was enough. Blair would spend the next week bullying innocent villagers and making a hash of the investigation. Someone needed to do the actual detective work, and that someone, as usual, would have to be Hamish Macbeth. He slipped away while Blair was haranguing the hotel owner about the quality of the sandwiches, and headed for the neat row of cottages where the Curry sisters lived. If anyone in Loch Dubh knew what was going on, it would be Nessie and Jessie. The twin spinsters had raised gossip to an art form, and between them they knew every scandal, secret, and snippet of information in the village. Nessie answered the door, her spare frame draped in a floral apron that had seen better days. Behind her, Jessie hovered like an echo. "Constable Macbeth," Nessie said, her voice sharp as vinegar. "We've already given our statements to that dreadful fat man from Strathbane." "That dreadful fat man," Jessie repeated, nodding vigorously. "I know, and I'm sorry to trouble you again." Hamish gave them his most charming smile. "But I was hoping you might help me with something unofficial. You see, that dreadful fat man doesn't know the village like you do." Nessie's expression softened slightly. "Well, I suppose you'd better come in then." "Come in then," Jessie echoed. The cottage was as neat as a pin, every surface dusted and polished, and every cushion precisely placed. The sisters installed Hamish in their best chair, and provided tea in china cups so delicate he was afraid to hold them too tightly. "Now then," Nessie said, settling herself opposite him, "what is it you want to know?" "Everything," Hamish said simply. "Everything about Julian Vane from the moment he arrived." The sisters exchanged glances, communicating in that wordless way that twins sometimes had. Then Nessie leaned forward conspiratorially. "He was a nasty piece of work, that one," she said with relish. "Throwing his weight around, threatening folk with lawyers." Threatening folk, Jessie confirmed. But there was something else, Nessie continued. Yesterday afternoon we saw him down by the harbour. He was arguing with a young man. We'd never seen the lad before. Never seen him before, Jessie added. Hamish's interest sharpened. Can you describe him? 30-ish, maybe younger. Dark hair, expensive suit that didn't fit quite right. City clothes, you know. City clothes. He was shouting at Mr. Vane, waving his arms about. We couldn't hear what they were saying, but it looked heated. Very heated. And after, Hamish prompted. The young man stormed off toward the hotel. Mr. Vane stood there looking pleased with himself, like a cat with cream. Like a cat with cream, Jessie nodded sagely. Hamish made mental notes. A mysterious stranger arguing with the victim hours before his death. That was worth investigating. Then he thanked the sisters and made his escape before they could offer him more tea and the inevitable homemade shortbread that would require at least another hour of small talk. His next stop was less orthodox. Angus MacDonald lived in a cottage on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by the sort of mystical bric-a-brac that tourists expected from a Highland seer. Crystal balls, tarot cards, and enough Celtic knotwork to strangle a horse. Hamish had known Angus since they were boys together, and he knew for a fact that the old fraud had about as much second sight as lugs. What Angus did have was an extensive network of gossipy relatives scattered across the Highlands, which was considerably more useful than any supernatural ability. "I've been expecting you," Angus intoned as he opened the door, his white beard quivering with dramatic effect. "Have you now?" Hamish said dryly. "And I don't suppose your second sight told you I'd be wanting information about Julian Vane? The spirits speak to me in mysterious ways." "Aye, well, they can speak in plain English for once. What have you heard?" Angus dropped the mystical act and grinned. "Come in then, and I'll tell you what my cousin in Strathbane heard from his wife's sister who works at the solicitor's office." Over a dram of truly terrible whisky that Angus claimed had healing properties, Hamish learned that Vane had been making inquiries about property records going back decades. He'd been particularly interested in land transfers and bankruptcies from the 1970s and 80s. "Looking for dirt, most like," Angus said, scratching his beard. "Man like that. He'd use anything to get leverage." "Blackmail, you mean?" "I'm saying nothing of the sort, but if I were you, I'd be looking at folk who might have something to hide." Which, Hamish reflected as he walked back toward the village, was virtually everyone in Lochdoub. Highland communities had long memories and complicated histories. Dig deep enough, and you'd find skeletons in every closet. He found Jimmy Anderson at the hotel bar, looking like a man in desperate need of rescue from Blair's tyranny. "Hamish," Jimmy said with evident relief, "save me. Another hour of listening to Blair and I'll do something we'll both regret." "Come on then," Hamish said. "I've a decent bottle of malt back at the station. We can go over what you've got so far." Jimmy needed no further encouragement. They walked through the gathering dusk, the other loch reflecting the last rays of sunlight like molten copper. Lugs greeted them with enthusiasm, while Sonsia observed the proceedings with feline disdain from her perch on the windowsill. Hamish poured generous measures into 2 glasses and settled into his armchair. "Right then, what does the official investigation have?" Jimmy pulled out his notebook, though they both knew this was thoroughly unofficial. Body was positioned deliberately. No question about that. Time of death between midnight and 3 in the morning. Cause of death, massive skull fracture from a single blow with that bloody great peat cutter. Premeditated, then? Oh, aye. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, knew where that tool was kept, knew how to get up to the stones in the dark. He just knew when Vane would be there. How did they know that last bit? Jimmy shrugged. That's the question, isn't it? Vane told half the pub he was going up there at midnight to commune with the ancient energies, or some such rubbish. Anyone could have heard him. Hamish sipped his whisky thoughtfully. What about the digging around the body? Forensics is still analysing the soil samples. Blair thinks it's evidence of a struggle, but I'm not so sure. The holes were too regular, too deliberate, like someone was searching for something. The Jacobite gold, Hamish said suddenly. The what now? Old legend. Supposedly there's gold buried beneath the standing stones, hidden there after Culloden. Load of nonsense, of course. But tourists love it. Think someone actually believed it? I think someone might have convinced Vane he believed it. Good way to get a greedy man to a lonely spot in the middle of the night. Jimmy whistled softly. That's devious, that is. Murder usually is. Hamish refilled their glasses. What about physical evidence? Boot prints, size 11 Wellingtons. We're checking them against everyone who was at the scene this morning, plus anyone who had contact with Vane yesterday. There's trace evidence on the murder weapon, some fibres and such gone to the lab. And get this, there were partial fingerprints on the handle, but they're too smudged to be useful. Gloves then? Most likely. Oh, and there's one more thing. The police surgeon found something odd in Vane's jacket pocket. A threatening note, handwritten. Stay away from what isn't yours or you'll regret it. No signature. Hamish frowned. That seems a bit obvious, doesn't it? Actual written threats before a murder? Blair thinks it proves premeditation. I think it's too bloody convenient myself. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the peat fire flicker and listening to Lugg snore gently by the hearth. Outside, true darkness had fallen, the kind of Highland darkness that was absolute and infinite. Blair's going to make a mess of this, Jimmy said finally. He always does. He'll arrest the first likely suspect and damn the evidence. Aye, Hamish agreed. Which is why we need to work fast, before some innocent soul ends up in the frame for something they didn't do. Unofficially, of course. Of course. Jimmy raised his glass. Yeah, to unofficial investigations and the glory going to fat incompetent bastards. Hamish clinked his glass against Jimmy's. Slaint. After Jimmy had staggered off into the night, Hamish sat alone with his thoughts and his animals. Somewhere out there, a killer was sleeping soundly, confident they'd committed the perfect crime. They'd positioned the body like some pagan sacrifice, searched for mythical treasure, and left just enough evidence to point in a dozen different directions. But they'd made one mistake. They'd killed someone in Hamish Macbeth's village, and Hamish took that very personally indeed. Chapter 4, The Blackmailer's Ledger. The autopsy report arrived the following morning, delivered by a spotty young constable from Strathbane, who looked terrified of Blair and grateful to escape back to civilization. Hamish intercepted him at the station and learned, through judicious application of tea and sympathy, that the pathologist had confirmed death by a single, powerful blow to the skull. The angle of impact suggested someone of average height, right-handed, and with enough strength to swing the heavy iron tool with considerable force. Could be anyone, then, Hamish muttered to Luggs, who wagged his tail in agreement. What interested Hamish more was the pathologist's note that there were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. Vane had been struck from behind, probably never knowing what hit him, and that suggested either someone he trusted or someone skilled enough to approach silently in the dark. Blair, predictably, was holding forth in the incident room about swift justice and making examples. Hamish could hear him through the hotel's thin walls as he passed by on his way to Vane's rented cottage. The cottage was one of the newer holiday lets on the outskirts of the village, all modern conveniences and Highland charm carefully manufactured for tourists. The forensics team had already been through it, leaving behind the telltale residue of fingerprint powder and displaced furniture. Hamish had the key, obtained through the simple expedient of being friendly with Mrs. McBean, who owned the property. She'd been happy to lend it to that nice constable Macbeth, rather than the horrible rude man from Strathbane. The cottage was exactly what Hamish had expected. Expensive luggage, designer clothes, and the sort of toiletries that cost more than most people's weekly shopping. Vane had travelled light but luxuriously. Hamish moved methodically through the rooms, looking for what the forensics team might have missed, because they didn't know what they were looking for. He found it in the bedroom, behind a hideous painting of a Highland stag that was bolted to the wall. The painting swung aside on hidden hinges, revealing a small wall safe with an electronic keypad. Hamish stared at it thoughtfully. The forensics team would have noted it, but without the combination they'd have left it for later. Blair probably didn't even know it existed yet. The question was, did Hamish have any right to open it without proper authorization? The answer, strictly speaking, was no. On the other hand, Blair would take weeks to get a warrant, by which time any evidence inside might be moved or destroyed by whoever had access to the cottage. Hamish's grandmother had always said that sometimes the letter of the law and the spirit of justice weren't quite the same thing. He tried the most obvious combinations first: Vane's birthday, which he'd noted from the man's driving licence, the date backwards, the cottage's dress. Nothing. Then, on a hunch born of years of observing human nature, he tried the numbers that spelled out Vane on a telephone keypad. The safe clicked open. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, a stack of £50 notes that would have choked a horse, and a collection of documents in plastic folders. Hamish pulled out the ledger first and flipped it open. What he found made his blood run cold. It was a blackmailer's record book, meticulously organised. Names, dates, secrets, and payment schedules. Vane hadn't just been a spiritual retreat developer. He'd been a predator, using his access to property records and historical documents to unearth people's buried secrets and bleed them dry. Hamish recognised several names from the village. Archie McLean owed £3,000, with a note about unregistered fishing shed, planning violation 1998. Dr. Brodie was down for £5,000, marked medical negligence claim settled privately, 2003. There were others too, names from neighbouring villages, all with their private shames laid bare in Vane's neat, merciless handwriting. The last entry made Hamish pause. It was dated 2 days before the murder, and simply read, M. Campbell, Lochdub, Historical Land Fraud, 1982, Father's Suicide, Stolen Artefacts, Potential 10,000. Hamish stared at the entry, his mind racing. Mary Campbell. Sweet, helpful Mary who brought scones and made tea and tried to keep the peace. What possible dark secret could she have that was worth £10,000? Before he could investigate further, he heard the crunch of gravel outside. Quickly, he photographed each page of the ledger with his mobile phone, replaced everything in the safe, and swung the painting back into position. He was examining the bookshelf with studied casualness when Blair barged through the door with Anderson in tow. Macbeth! What the hell are you doing here? Just checking the premises, sir, making sure everything's secure. That's not your job. That's what Strathbane Forensics is for. Blair's face was the colour of raw beef. Get out. You're contaminating my crime scene. Already been processed, sir. I was just... Out! Hamish left, but not before catching Jimmy's eye and receiving a barely perceptible wink. Jimmy would make sure Blair found the safe eventually, just not before Hamish had time to follow up on what he'd discovered. He walked back through the village, his mind churning. The mysterious young man the Curry sisters had seen must be someone from the ledger. Someone Vane was blackmailing. But who? And more importantly, had Mary Campbell known about Vane's discovery of her family's secret? He found her, as if summoned by his thoughts, waiting outside his police station with another basket. Constable Macbeth, she said with her gentle smile, I made some soup. I thought you might appreciate something warm, what with all this dreadful business. That's very kind, Mrs. Campbell. Hamish took the basket, studying her face for any sign of distress or guilt. He saw only the same placid concern she always showed. I've been thinking, Mary said softly, falling into step beside him as he unlocked the station door. About what you said the other day, about the locals being attached to the standing stones. I? Well, there are old stories, you know, about treasure buried there, Jacobite gold from after the 45. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes. Silly, of course, but I wondered if perhaps Mr. Vane believed it. He seemed the type to believe in that sort of thing. What makes you say that? Oh, just the way he talked. All that nonsense about energy and seekers. A man who believes in crystal healing might well believe in buried treasure, mightn't he? It was almost exactly what Hamish had suggested to Jimmy the night before. Too exactly, perhaps. Did you mention this theory to DCI Blair? I tried, but he was rather rude. Told me to stop wasting his time with fairy stories, she sighed. I suppose he knows best. Hamish doubted that very much, but he said nothing. Instead, he thanked her for the soup and watched her walk away. A small, neat figure in her hand-knitted cardigan and sensible shoes. Inside the station, he found the soup was excellent, rich with vegetables and barley. He ate it while scrolling through the photographs of the ledger on his phone, trying to make sense of what he'd found. The blackmail explained the motive, certainly. Half the village had reason to want Vane dead. But it didn't explain the ritualistic positioning of the body, the frantic digging, or the choice of weapon. Those elements suggested something more personal than simple revenge for blackmail. His phone buzzed. Jimmy Anderson texting. Blair found safe, having kittens. Ledger gone missing. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Hamish smiled grimly and texted back. Not a thing. But you might want to check the fingerprints on file against those size 11 boot prints. The reply came almost immediately. Already did. Got a match. Blair's bringing someone in for questioning. You're not going to like it. Hamish's stomach sank. He had a terrible feeling he knew exactly who Blair had decided to arrest. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. Luggs looked up hopefully, but Hamish shook his head. Not this time, boy. This is official business and it's about to get ugly. The dog slumped back down with a sigh that suggested he understood perfectly. In Lochdu, official business was rarely anything but trouble, and when Blair was involved, ugly was practically guaranteed. Hamish hurried through the village, his long legs eating up the distance to the hotel. He could only hope he wasn't too late to prevent Blair from making a catastrophic mistake. Though knowing Blair's track record, catastrophic mistakes were rather his specialty. Chapter 5. Expanding the suspect pool. Hamish arrived at the hotel just in time to see Blair dragging Archie McLean out of the bar by his collar. The fisherman's face a portrait of bewildered panic. I didn't do nothing, Archie was protesting, his voice rising to a squeak. I swear on my mother's grave. Save it for the station, Blair snarled, clearly delighted with himself. We've got your boot prints all over the crime scene, McLean. Size 11 Wellingtons with that distinctive worn patch on the left heel. Same boots you're wearing right now. Aye, because half the men in Lochdu wear the same bloody boots. They sell them at Macpherson's store. Blair wasn't listening. He had his arrest, his headline, and his triumph over the backward Highland village that had always looked down on him. The fact that he'd probably arrested an innocent man was irrelevant to him. Sir, Hamish said quietly, a word. Not now, Macbeth. Can't you see I'm busy bringing a murderer to justice? That's just it, sir. I don't think... Nobody cares what you think. You're just the village bobby. Leave the real detective work to professionals. Blair shoved Archie toward the waiting police car. Anderson, get him processed. I want this wrapped up before the press conference tomorrow. Hamish watched them drive away, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. Behind him, the hotel door opened and Mrs. McLean emerged, her formidable bulk shaking with rage and fear. That fat bastard's arrested my Archie, she announced to the street at large. My Archie wouldn't hurt a fly, and everyone knows it. Don't worry, Mrs. McLean, Hamish said with more confidence than he felt. We'll sort this out. You'd better, Hamish Macbeth, or I'll be having words with you too. The threat was empty, and they both knew it, but Mrs. McLean needed someone to shout at, and Hamish was convenient. He let her vent for a solid 5 minutes before she finally ran out of steam and stomped back inside to console herself with cooking something violent involving meat and a cleaver. Hamish pulled out his phone and called Jimmy Anderson. Tell me Blair's got more than just boot prints, he said without preamble. Jimmy's sigh was audible even over the dodgy mobile connection. He's got boot prints and motive. Archie owed Vane money, and they had that public argument about the harbour shed. So does half the village owe him money. I found his ledger, Jimmy. The man was blackmailing everyone from here to Strathbane. There was a pause. You found what now? Never mind. The point is, Archie McLean might have had motive, but he didn't have the temperament for this kind of murder. This was planned, calculated. Archie loses his temper, he throws a punch. He doesn't arrange bodies like some pagan sacrifice. Try telling that to Blair. He's already called the press. Hamish swore colourfully in Gaelic. Right. Then I'd better work fast. Who else had access to Vane yesterday? Anyone besides the mysterious young man the Curry sisters saw? Funny you should ask. We've identified him. Callum Vane, Julian's nephew from Edinburgh. Checked into the Tommel Castle Hotel 2 days ago under his own name. Apparently Uncle Julian cut him out of the family will. And young Callum's got gambling debts up to his eyeballs. That's promising. Where is he now? Still at the hotel last I checked. Blair hasn't got round to him yet. Too busy celebrating his brilliant arrest. Hamish thanked Jimmy and rang off. Tommel Castle Hotel was a 40-minute drive, but it would be worth it to interview Callum Vane before Blair scared him into lawyering up. He was halfway to his Land Rover when Dr. Brodie flagged him down, the physician looking distinctly agitated. "Hamish, a word if you please." Dr. Brodie was a man in his 60s, still handsome in a craggy Highland way, with silver hair and the careful movements of someone who had learned to live with chronic arthritis. He'd been the village doctor for 30 years and had delivered half the children in Lochdoub. "What can I do for you?" "Doctor?" "It's about this dreadful business with Mr. Vane." Brodie glanced around nervously. "I need to speak to you in confidence." They retreated to the doctor's surgery, a converted cottage that smelled of antiseptic and old leather. Brodie closed the door carefully and turned to face Hamish with the expression of a man about to confess to murder. "Julian Vane was blackmailing me," he said baldly. Hamish nodded, unsurprised. "I know. I found his ledger." "Something about a medical negligence claim?" Brodie's shoulders sagged with relief. "You know then?" "Yes. 10 years ago I made a mistake with a diagnosis. Delayed treatment for a patient who subsequently died. The family could have sued, could have had me struck off, but they agreed to a private settlement instead. Vane found out somehow, or threatened to go to the medical board unless I paid him £5,000. Did you pay? I was going to, but then he was murdered. And now?" Brodie spread his hands helplessly. "Blair will think I killed him to avoid paying." "Did you?" "Good God, no. I was playing bridge with the Reverend Wellington until well past midnight. His wife was there, and Mrs. Douglas. We can all vouch for each other." Hamish made a mental note to verify the alibi. "Then you've nothing to worry about. Stay calm, tell the truth, and for heaven's sake don't go wandering around the standing stones in the middle of the night." Brodie flushed. I mean, how did you know about that?" "Lucky guess." "What were you really doing up there, Doctor?" The physician's flush deepened to crimson. "If I tell you—" "You'll think I'm mad. Try me." "I was disposing of evidence. A salmon, poached from the Laird's River. My housekeeper would have been furious if she'd found it in my freezer, and I couldn't very well take it to the police, could I?" Despite everything, Hamish felt a smile tugging at his lips. "You buried a poached salmon at a murder scene?" "It seemed like a good idea at the time. The ground was already disturbed, and I thought, oh, this is ridiculous." "Aye, it is. But it's also not murder, which is what matters. Go home, Doctor. Forget about the salmon, and if anyone asks, you spent a quiet night in with a medical journal." After Brodie had left, looking considerably relieved, Hamish sat in his Land Rover and updated his mental list of suspects. Archie McLean was in custody, but almost certainly innocent. Like Callum Vane had motive and opportunity, but needed proper questioning. Dr. Brodie had an alibi that could be verified, and Mary Campbell had a secret that Vane had discovered, though what exactly that secret was remained frustratingly unclear. The drive to Tommel Castle Hotel took him through some of the most beautiful scenery in the Highlands, though Hamish barely noticed it. His mind was too busy sorting through possibilities and probabilities. Callum Vane proved easy to find. He was in the hotel bar, nursing what looked like his fourth whisky of the afternoon, and radiating the particular brand of misery that came from expensive mistakes and inescapable consequences. He was younger than Hamish had expected, probably no more than 30, with his uncle's dark hair but without the arrogance. Instead, he looked defeated, like a man who'd already lost everything and was just waiting for the final blow. "Mr. Vane?" Hamish approached the table carefully. "I'm Police Constable Macbeth from Lochdoub. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your uncle." Callum looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Finally, I've been expecting you lot since I heard he was dead. Suppose you think I killed him for the inheritance. Did you? Wouldn't have done me any good. Uncle Julian changed his will 6 months ago. Left everything to some bloody spiritual foundation. I get nothing, not a penny." He laughed bitterly. "Came all the way up here to beg him to reconsider, and the bastard laughed in my face. Said I was a disgrace to the family name." "When was this?" "2 days ago. Had a blazing row with him by the harbour. Half the village probably saw us. Then he told me to get out of his sight, so I did. Drove straight back here and got drunk. Been drunk ever since, more or less." "Can anyone verify where you were the night your uncle died?" "The night porter. I was here from 10 o'clock onwards, drinking in my room and feeling sorry for myself. Ordered room service at midnight, whiskey at 1 in the morning. The porter brought it up himself, probably thinking I was going to do something stupid." Callum's smile was bleak. "Which I suppose I was. Just not what you're thinking." Hamish made notes, already fairly certain the alibi would check out. Callum Vane was many things. Foolish, desperate, self-pitying. But he didn't strike Hamish as a killer. More importantly, he had no reason to kill an uncle who'd already written him out of the will. "One more thing," Hamish said. Did your uncle ever mention Lockdoob to you? Any connection he had to the place besides the property he bought?" Callum frowned. "No. Why would he? He'd never been there before last week. Just saw a property listing and decided it would make a good investment. That was Uncle Julian, always chasing the next scheme." Which meant, Hamish reflected as he drove back to Lockdoob, that whatever secret Mary Campbell had, it was connected to Julian's father, not Julian himself. The sins of the fathers perhaps coming back to haunt the sons. The question was, had those sins been worth killing for? Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. The following morning brought a har rolling in from the sea, the kind of thick sea mist that turned the world into a grey tunnel and made even familiar streets feel alien and dangerous. Hamish stood at his kitchen window, watching it press against the glass like something alive, and felt a growing conviction that he was missing something obvious. Archie McLean was still in custody in Strathbane, and according to Jimmy's last text, Blair was strutting about like a peacock, giving interviews to anyone with a camera. The press conference was scheduled for noon, at which point Blair would announce he'd solved the case in record time through brilliant detective work. Never mind that Archie's alibi was solid. Hamish had spent the previous evening quietly verifying it, and what he'd found was both amusing and exonerating. Archie had indeed been at the pub the night of the murder, but not drinking. He'd been hiding in the cellar, avoiding his wife who'd been on the warpath about his spending money on rounds for his friends. The landlord confirmed it, as did 3 other men who'd helped smuggle food down to him. Archie hadn't emerged until dawn, by which time Vane was already dead and stiffening. Blair, of course, didn't want to hear it. Inconvenient facts had never bothered him before. Hamish was contemplating his next move when his mobile rang, Jimmy Anderson sounding harassed. "Hamish, we've got a problem. Someone reported seeing Dr. Brodie up at the Standing Stones last night acting suspicious." "I know all about that," Hamish said. "It's nothing." Blair doesn't think it's nothing. He thinks Brodie was returning to the scene of the crime. He's bringing him in for questioning. Hamish swore. "Jimmy, listen to me carefully. Brodie was not at those stones the night of the murder. He was playing cards with Reverend Wellington until well past midnight. I verified it." "What was he doing there last night, then?" "That's complicated, and not relevant to the murder. You know what he was doing, don't you?" "Aye, and it's got nothing to do with killing anyone. Trust me on this." There was a pause, then Jimmy said carefully, "This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain poached salmon, would it?" "How did you—" "Forensics found fish scales in the disturbed soil. Fresh ones. Blair thinks it's evidence of the murderer having a meal at the scene, which is barking mad. But you know what he's like once he gets an idea in his head." Hamish pinched the bridge of his nose. "Right, I'm coming to Strathbane. Don't let Blair arrest Brodie until I get there." "I'll try, but you know what he's like." Hamish did indeed know what Blair was like, which was why he broke several speed limits getting to Strathbane. He found Dr. Brodie in an interview room, looking pale and shaken, with Blair looming over him like a malevolent thundercloud. "Constable Macbeth," Blair said with dangerous pleasantness. "How kind of you to join us, though I don't recall requesting your presence. Sir, I have information pertinent to Dr. Brodie's whereabouts the night of the murder. Do you now? And I suppose this information conveniently clears him of all suspicion." It does, actually. He was playing bridge with the Reverend Wellington, the Reverend's wife, and Mrs. Douglas from 9 o'clock until midnight. I've verified it with all 3 witnesses. Blair's face went through several interesting colour changes. "That doesn't explain what he was doing at the crime scene last night." "That's a separate matter entirely, sir, one that has nothing to do with murder." "I'll be the judge of that." Hamish looked at Dr. Brodie, who gave a tiny, miserable nod of permission. Dr. Brodie was disposing of an illegally caught salmon, sir. Nothing more sinister than that. He buried it among the disturbed earth to hide it from his housekeeper. The silence that followed was profound. Blair's mouth opened and closed several times without any sound emerging. Finally he managed, "A salmon." "Yes, sir. So, a fish." "He buried a bloody fish at my murder scene!" "Technically, sir, the murder scene had already been processed and released. Dr. Brodie simply took advantage of ground that was already disturbed." Blair's face had achieved a shade of purple that Hamish hadn't previously known was possible in nature. "Get out, both of you. Get out before I arrest you both for being bloody idiots." Hamish ushered Dr. Brodie out quickly before Blair could change his mind or have a stroke, whichever came first. "Thank you," Brodie said fervently once they were safely in the car park. "I thought I was done for. Just don't poach any more fish, Doctor, and definitely don't bury them at crime scenes. Believe me, I've learned my lesson." Hamish drove back to Lochdoub through the thinning mist, his mind working furiously. 3 suspects down, and still no clear answer. Archie had an alibi. Callum Vane had an alibi. Dr. Brodie had an alibi. Who did that leave? The answer, when it came to him, made him go cold all over. It left the one person who'd been helpful from the start, the one person who'd been at every important juncture, offering assistance and suggestions, the one person whose name appeared in Vane's ledger with a secret that touched on historical land fraud and her father's suicide, Mary Campbell. But that was ridiculous. Mary was a gentle soul who made soup and wove traditional textiles. She couldn't possibly be a murderer, could she? Hamish thought about the ritualistic positioning of the body, the knowledge of the land required to navigate the stones in darkness, the choice of weapon from the village's own heritage collection. Someone who volunteered at the Heritage Centre would know exactly where that peat cutter was kept. Someone who'd lived in Lochdoub all her life would know the standing stones like the back of her hand, even in pitch darkness. And someone who'd suffered a terrible wrong decades ago might have very good reason to want revenge on the son of the man who'd caused it. He pulled over at the side of the road and dialed Jimmy Anderson. "Jimmy, I need you to do something for me quietly. Check the traffic cameras on the Strathbane Road for the night of the murder. See if Callum Vane's car shows up. Already done. He's clear. Car's on camera heading toward Tommel Castle at 11:30. Nowhere near Lochdoub." "Right. And can you get me everything you can find about a land fraud case in Lochdoub from 1982? Involving a family named Campbell." There was a pause. "Hamish, what are you on to?" "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Just get me the information and don't tell Blair." As if I would. He's still having apoplexy about the salmon. Hamish drove on, his mind churning. If he was right about Mary, then he needed to tread very carefully indeed. Accusing a beloved village figure of murder without solid proof would be disastrous. But if he waited too long, she might destroy evidence or flee. He found her, as if his thoughts had summoned her, walking along the harbour with a shopping bag. She smiled when she saw him, that same gentle, grandmotherly smile. "Constable Macbeth, lovely to see you. I was just at the fishmonger's. Would you like some fresh haddock for your tea?" "That's very kind, Mrs. Campbell. But I'm fine. Such a shame about poor Archie being arrested. Everyone knows he couldn't have done it. He was hiding in the pub cellar all night, avoiding his wife. Hamish went very still. How did you know that? Oh, everyone knows. You can't keep secrets in a village this size, she laughed lightly. Though I suppose some secrets do stay buried, don't they? Aye, Hamish said slowly. Some do. They stood there in the misty morning, the water lapping gently at the harbour wall, two people having a perfectly ordinary conversation that was anything but ordinary. I should be getting on, Mary said finally. This fish won't cook itself. Do take care, Constable. These are dangerous times. Hamish watched her walk away, a small, harmless-looking woman in a hand-knitted cardigan, and felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. He just needed proof, and he thought he knew where to find it. That evening Hamish returned to the Standing Stones alone, carrying a powerful torch and a keen sense that he was missing something crucial. The forensics team had been thorough, but they didn't know what they were looking for. They didn't know about Mary's connection to the land, didn't know about her father's suicide, didn't know about the ledger entry that mentioned stolen artifacts. He searched the disturbed areas methodically, looking for anything the team might have overlooked. And there, snagged on a rough edge of the iron peat cutter handle, he found it. A single fibre. Hand-spun Highland wool, dyed with natural plant materials in a distinctive shade of heather purple. The exact wool Mary Campbell used for her traditional weaving, wool that she sold at craft fairs and exhibitions, wool that bore her signature style. Hamish bagged it carefully, his heart heavy. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was enough to start asking harder questions. The question was, would Mary answer them, or would she prove to be far more dangerous than her gentle facade suggested? He had a feeling he was about to find out. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. The problem with living in a small Highland village, Hamish reflected over his morning porridge, was that investigating your neighbours felt uncomfortably like spying on family, and accusing one of them of murder felt like betrayal, even when all the evidence pointed in that direction. He had the wool fibre carefully preserved in an evidence bag. He had the ledger entry about Mary's family secret. He had her suspicious helpfulness and her uncanny knowledge of things she shouldn't know. What he didn't have was motive clear enough to convince a jury, or Blair for that matter. Jimmy Anderson arrived mid-morning with a thick folder of documents and the harried expression of a man who'd been up all night doing research. "You owe me a bottle of the good stuff for this," he said, and was dumping the folder on Hamish's kitchen table. "I had to sweet-talk 3 different archivists and bribe a records clerk with a box of shortbread. What did you find?" "Everything you asked for and then some." Jimmy accepted the coffee Hamish poured him gratefully. "The Campbell land fraud case from 1982. Makes for grim reading." Hamish opened the folder and began to read. The story that emerged was a tragedy in the classic Highland mould, full of broken promises and casual cruelty. In 1982, a developer named Richard Vane, Julian's father, had entered into a business partnership with Malcolm Campbell, a Loch Dubh crofter who owned the land around the Standing Stones. Vane had promised to develop the land respectfully, preserving the ancient site while creating jobs for the village. Campbell, trusting and desperate for income, or had signed over significant control. Instead, Vane had systematically bankrupted the partnership through fraudulent accounting, then purchased Campbell's remaining assets for a fraction of their value when the debts came due. Campbell had fought the seizure, claiming Vane had stolen family artefacts that were on the land, but without proof, the courts ruled against him. 6 months later, Malcolm Campbell had hanged himself in his barn, leaving behind a widow and a teenage daughter. The daughter's name was Mary. "That's your motive," Jimmy said quietly. The Standing Stones weren't just sacred ground to her. They were her family's land, stolen through fraud. And when Julian Vane bought them, it must have felt like the final insult. Hamish closed the folder, feeling sick. He was profiting from his father's crime. There's more. "Yeah, I checked with the land registry." Julian Vane found something when he was researching the property deeds. There's a note in his file about historical artefacts' possible heritage value. He'd applied for an archaeological survey permit. He found the artefacts her father had hidden. the ones he claimed Vane Sr. had stolen. Looks that way, and if he threatened to expose that Malcolm Campbell had taken them before the bankruptcy, even if he'd done it to save them from Vane, it would destroy her father's memory and prove he was a thief. Hamish stood and paced to the window. That's motive enough for murder right there. So what do? March in and arrest her? On what evidence? A single wool fibre that could have got there a dozen innocent ways? Blair would laugh us out of Strathbane. Then we need more evidence. Or a confession. Aye, Hamish said slowly. But first I need to eliminate every other possibility. I need to be absolutely certain. Over the next 2 days, Hamish worked methodically through every remaining loose end, determined to be thorough. Blair's press conference had been postponed when Archie's lawyer presented the Cellar alibi with 4 sworn witnesses. Blair was now claiming he'd never really suspected Archie, that it had been routine questioning all along. The press weren't fooled, but they were patient. A murder in a picturesque Highland village sold papers whether or not there was an arrest. Hamish verified Dr. Brodie's bridge game alibi again, this time checking the details obsessively. The Reverend's wife remembered what hands she'd been dealt. Mrs. Douglas recalled the score down to the last point. Brodie had been there from 9 until after midnight. No question. He drove back to Tommel Castle Hotel and confirmed Callum Vane's alibi with the night porter, who remembered the young man quite clearly. Miserable drunk he was, the porter said. Ordered a bottle of whisky at midnight, another at 1 in the morning. I brought them up myself, both times. He was definitely in his room, watching some rubbish on the television and feeling sorry for himself. You're certain about the times? Positive. I logged it in the service book. Have to, you see, for billing. The service book confirmed it. Callum Vane had been 40 miles away at the time of his uncle's death, with documented proof. Even Archie's cellar hideout checked out when Hamish spoke to the landlord's son, who'd been the one to smuggle down sandwiches and crisps. Felt sorry for the poor sod, the lad said. Mrs. McLean was on a right tear that night. Archie crawled down there about 9 o'clock and didn't come up until he saw the police cars the next morning. Thought they were coming for him at first. For the pub tab he hasn't paid. Every suspect Hamish checked had an alibi that held up under scrutiny. Every suspect except one. He spent an evening going over Mary Campbell's movements that night, or rather, the lack of them. No one had seen her after 8 o'clock when she'd left the Heritage Centre after her volunteer shift. She lived alone in a cottage on the edge of the village. She could have slipped out at midnight, walked to the standing stones in darkness, killed Vane, and been home before dawn with no one the wiser. The knowledge of the land she'd need. She'd grown up playing among those stones before her father lost them. The strength to swing the heavy peat cutter. Hamish had seen her lift bolts of wet wool at craft fairs. She was stronger than she looked. The positioning of the body. Someone steeped in Highland folklore would know all about the old ritual sacrifices, the bodies found in peat bogs arranged in ceremonial patterns. It all fit. It fit too well. Hamish sat in his kitchen late into the night, Lug snoring at his feet and Sonsi watching him with inscrutable golden eyes. Outside, the wind howled down from the mountains, bringing with it the first hints of early snow. He thought about Mary Campbell, her gentle smile and her kindness. He thought about her father, driven to suicide by greed and fraud. He thought about justice and revenge. And the fine line between the two. His phone buzzed. A text from Jimmy. Blair's getting desperate. Wants to rearrest Archie tomorrow unless we give him something better. What have you got? Hamish stared at the message for a long moment. Then he typed, "Give me until tomorrow afternoon. I think I can get you a confession." How? By asking the right questions. Be careful. If you're right about who it is, they've already killed once. Hamish looked at the wool fibre in its evidence bag, then at the file documenting a tragedy from 40 years ago that had finally come due. "I'll be careful," he typed back. "But first I need to know why. I need to hear it from her own lips." He knew it was risky. He knew Blair would have his head if he confronted a suspect without backup. But Hamish Macbeth had never done things the official way, and he wasn't about to start now. Tomorrow, He would visit Mary Campbell at the Heritage Centre. Tomorrow he would ask her about her father and the standing stones, and what really happened that foggy night when Julian Vane died among the ancient pillars. Tomorrow, one way or another, he would have his answers. He went to bed but didn't sleep. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song, and somewhere in the darkness a killer was sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that everyone thought her too gentle to be dangerous. It was, Hamish thought, as he finally drifted off near dawn, the oldest mistake in the world, underestimating the quiet ones. His grandmother had warned him about that once. She'd said the most dangerous animals in the Highlands weren't the stags with their impressive antlers, or the wildcats with their fierce claws. They were the adders, coiled silent in the heather, that you never saw coming until they struck. Chapter 8. The Weaver's Flaw. The Heritage Centre occupied a converted stone cottage near the church, its windows displaying traditional Highland crafts and faded photographs of Lochdoub in decades past. Hamish had passed it 1,000 times without giving it much thought, but now, approaching it in the thin morning light, it seemed to hold secrets in every shadow. Mary Campbell was alone inside, arranging a display of antique farm implements, with the care of someone handling precious relics. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed and smiled her gentle smile. "Constable Macbeth, how lovely! I was just thinking about you. Were you now?" Hamish closed the door behind him, noting the lack of other visitors. The centre rarely saw much traffic in winter. "I was wondering if you'd like some tea." "I've just put the kettle on." She moved toward the small kitchen at the back with her usual graceful economy of movement. "Actually, Mrs. Campbell, I wanted to ask you about something, a discrepancy in the timeline you gave to DCI Blair." Her hand paused on the kettle for just a fraction of a second. Then she continued pouring hot water into the teapot as if nothing had happened. "A discrepancy? I can't imagine what you mean." "You told DCI Blair that Julian Vane had been researching a specific historical deed, the one concerning the Campbell family land from 1982. Did I? Yes, I suppose I did mention that. The thing is, Mrs. Campbell, that deed was destroyed in a fire at the old council offices in 1995. You would know that, being a heritage volunteer. So how did you know Vane was researching it?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Mary finished pouring the tea with steady hands and brought 2 cups to the small table by the window. "Do sit down, Hamish. May I call you Hamish? I feel we've known each other long enough for first names." Hamish sat watching her carefully. She settled across from him like a bird coming to rest, all delicate movements and soft sounds. "You're quite right, of course," she said quietly. "The deed was destroyed. I made a mistake in my statement. The stress of it all, you understand. Finding a body like that, right where I used to play as a child." "Did you play there as a child, then? At the Standing Stones?" "Oh, yes. Before my father lost the land, before everything fell apart." Her voice remained placid, but something flickered in her eyes. "Those stones were my kingdom once upon a time." Hamish pulled out his notebook, making a show of consulting it. "There's another thing that's been bothering me. That threatening note found in Vane's pocket. The one that said, 'Stay away from what isn't yours or you'll regret it.'" "Yes, I remember DCI Blair mentioning it. It appeared very conveniently, didn't it? Right when Blair needed evidence of premeditation, and the timing of when you found it to give to the police. I'm afraid I don't follow. You gave Blair a list of everyone Vane had threatened that first morning, a very thorough list, but you added something to it later, didn't you? A threatening note allegedly written by Archie MacLean." Mary's cup stopped halfway to her lips. "I found it among some papers. I thought it was important. The handwriting didn't match Archie's. I checked with the samples from his fishing logs, but it did match the handwriting on the shopping list you made for the church fete last month. I compared them this morning." She set down her cup with great care. "That's quite the accusation, Constable." "It's not an accusation, Mrs. Campbell, it's an observation. Just like I observed that the wool fibre found on the murder weapon matches the distinctive hand-spun Highland wool you use in your weaving. The heather-dyed purple that's your signature colour. Many weavers use similar techniques. Not with that exact combination of plant dyes. I checked with the Craft Guild. Your method is unique, passed down from your mother." Hamish leaned forward slightly. "You were very helpful throughout this investigation, Mrs. Campbell. Almost too helpful. Offering theories about Jacobite gold, providing lists of suspects, bringing food and comfort to everyone involved. Classic misdirection, pointing us away from yourself." Mary sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice had lost its soft grandmother quality. It was harder now, sharper. "You're very clever, Hamish Macbeth. Everyone thinks you're lazy, content to potter about with your sheep and avoid promotion. But you see things, don't you? You always have. I see a woman who suffered a terrible wrong 40 years ago. A woman whose father was driven to suicide by a fraudulent business partner. A woman who spent decades waiting for her chance at justice." "Justice!" Mary laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Is that what you call it?" "My father died because Richard Vane stole everything from him. Our land, our livelihood, our future. And then that man's son came here, to the very place where my father used to walk with me on his shoulders, and announced he was going to turn it into a playground for rich fools seeking enlightenment. So you killed him." "I'm not saying I did anything of the sort." But her eyes held his steadily, and there was steel in them now. "But if someone did kill Julian Vane, perhaps you should ask yourself if the world is really worse off without him. He was a blackmailer, a cheat, just like his father. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." "How did you know he was blackmailing people? That wasn't common knowledge." Mary smiled thinly. "You're testing me. Very well. I'll tell you a story, Constable. Purely hypothetical. You understand?" "Of course. Suppose a woman spent her life in a village, hiding her true identity because the shame of her father's suicide was too much to bear. She became quiet, helpful, invisible, the perfect neighbour. And suppose one day a man appeared who looked exactly like the monster who destroyed her family. Suppose she did some research and discovered this man was planning to excavate the land where her father had hidden the last of their family treasures to keep them from the creditors. The artefacts mentioned in the court case. Small things, Celtic brooches, old coins, a silver chalice. Nothing valuable to anyone but us. My father buried them beneath the stones, planning to retrieve them when the legal troubles were over. But he never got the chance." Mary's voice had gone distant, remembering. "And suppose this woman discovered that Julian Vane had found evidence of those artefacts and was planning to use that knowledge to destroy her father's memory completely, to prove Malcolm Campbell had been a thief as well as a failure. That would be powerful motive for murder. Indeed, but it would also require careful planning. One would need to know the land intimately, to navigate it in darkness. One would need to know where to find the perfect weapon, something from the village's own heritage that would send a message, and one would need to lure the victim to the stones at precisely the right time, by convincing him there was Jacobite gold buried there. He was such a greedy man, so easy to manipulate. One anonymous note about treasure beneath the stones, and he was up there at midnight with a shovel. Cease digging frantically. Mary's smile was cold as winter. Purely hypothetically, of course. Hamish felt ice settling in his stomach. She was confessing, but in such a way that nothing she said could be used against her. She was too clever for that. "Mrs. Campbell, I need you to come with me to the station. We need to make this official." "Do we? On what evidence? A wool fibre that could have transferred innocently? A handwriting comparison that's hardly conclusive? The word of a lazy Highland constable against a respected member of the community?" She stood gracefully. "I don't think so, Hamish. Not unless you have something more substantial. I have motive, means, and opportunity. I have your knowledge of things you shouldn't know. I have theories, suspicions, nothing that would convince a jury." She moved to the door, opening it to let in the cold morning air. "And even if you could prove it, do you really want to? Think about it. Julian Vane was everything you despise. Arrogant, cruel, greedy. He destroyed lives for profit, just like his father before him. Is the world really better with him in it? That's not for me to decide, or you, isn't it? You decide every day, Hamish Macbeth. You decide which laws to enforce and which to overlook. Poached salmon, illegal still, sheep on the wrong grazing land. You protect this village by knowing when to look away. Murder is different. Is it? She tilted her head, studying him with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient. My father was murdered by Richard Vane as surely as if he'd put a rope around his neck himself. But that was legal, lawful, done with contracts and courts. Does that make it less of a crime? Hamish stood slowly, towering over her small frame, but feeling somehow at a disadvantage. I'll be back with a warrant, Mrs. Campbell, and with D.C.I. Blair. Will you? That seems unlikely. She smiled her gentle smile again, and it was terrible. Because you know what will happen. Blair will bungle the case. His evidence will be circumstantial at best, and I'll be acquitted, and the village will turn against you for persecuting a poor widow. You'll lose everything you've worked to protect here. She was right, and they both knew it. Think it over, Constable, Mary said softly. Think about what justice really means, and then decide what you're going to do. She closed the door gently, leaving Hamish standing alone in the cold morning, holding a truth he wasn't sure he could use. Chapter 9, Sins of the Past. Hamish walked back to the police station in a daze, Mary Campbell's words echoing in his head. She was right about one thing. Blair would make a hash of the prosecution. Circumstantial evidence, clever defence lawyers, and a sympathetic defendant who looked like everyone's favourite grandmother. The case would fall apart in court, and Hamish would be left looking like a fool who'd persecuted an innocent woman. But that didn't change the fact that she'd committed murder. He found Jimmy Anderson waiting for him at the station, leaning against the Land Rover with the patient air of a man who'd been there a while. Blair's having kittens, Jimmy announced. Wants to rearrest Archie this afternoon unless we give him something solid. Please tell me you've got something solid. Aye, Hamish said wearily. I've got a confession. Sort of. Sort of? The kind that won't hold up in court. The kind where the suspect admits everything while simultaneously denying everything. Hamish unlocked the station door and let them both inside. She's too clever by half, Jimmy. Smarter than Blair, smarter than me, probably smarter than the lot of us put together. We're talking about Mary Campbell. Sweet Mrs. Campbell, who makes soup. The same. Hamish filled the kettle and set it to boil, needing something to do with his hands. Only she's not sweet at all. She's been planning this for decades, waiting for her chance. He told Jimmy everything, from the land fraud to Malcolm Campbell's suicide to the artefacts hidden beneath the standing stones. He showed him the wool fibre, the handwriting comparison, the carefully constructed web of misdirection and false trails. When he finished, Jimmy let out a low whistle. That's... Christ, Hamish, that's cold-blooded. That's revenge 40 years in the making. But can we prove it? Really prove it? Beyond reasonable doubt? Hamish didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photographs he'd taken of Vane's ledger. There, on the last page, was the entry about Mary Campbell. He showed it to Jimmy. Historical land fraud, 1982. Father's suicide. Stolen artefacts. She knew Vane had discovered the truth about those artefacts. If we can find them, if we can prove they exist, and that Vane was threatening to expose her father as a thief. That's motive, not proof she killed him. No, but combined with the wool fibre, the knowledge of the land, the fake threatening note she planted. Hamish paused. Where would you hide something you wanted kept secret for 40 years? In the last place anyone would look. Exactly. And where's the last place anyone would look for artefacts supposedly buried beneath the standing stones? Jimmy's eyes widened. You think they're still there? After all this time? I think Mary never retrieved them because doing so would have required digging at the stones, which would have drawn attention. I think she left them buried, and I think Vane found evidence of exactly where they were. That's what he was digging for the night he died. Then we need to find them before she moves them. She won't move them now. Too much attention on the site, but if we can locate them, if we can prove Vane knew about them... Hamish grabbed his jacket. Come on, we're going to do some archaeology. The standing stones stood silent under a grey sky that promised rain. The police tape had been removed, and the disturbed earth where Vane had died was slowly returning to grass. Jimmy had brought a couple of small spades from the station, though Hamish hoped they wouldn't need them. Right, Hamish said, surveying the area. Vane was digging here, here, and here. He pointed to the 3 spots where the earth had been disturbed. Random locations if you don't know what you're looking for, but if you plot them on a map... He pulled out his phone and called up a satellite image of the stones marking the 3 points. They formed a rough triangle with the largest stone at one vertex. The largest stone was the one Vane's head was oriented toward when we found him, Jimmy said slowly. Ritualistic positioning, we thought. Or Mary making a point. This is the stone my father used to bring me to. This is our heritage you desecrated. Hamish moved to the base of the largest stone, examining the ground carefully. Vane was getting close, but he hadn't found it yet. Otherwise, why keep digging? So where is it? Hamish thought about Malcolm Campbell, a desperate man trying to save the last remnants of his family's history. He thought about where a man would hide something precious, something he planned to retrieve later when the legal troubles were over. Not under the stones themselves, too obvious, and too hard to dig without being noticed, but somewhere nearby, somewhere only someone who knew the land would think to look. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the stone circle, Jimmy following. The ground here was a mixture of heather and rough grass, with outcrops of rock breaking through in places. Nothing looked disturbed. Then Hamish noticed it. A small stone cairn, the kind hill walkers built as landmarks, sitting about 20 yards from the circle. It looked ancient, natural, forgettable. But one of the stones in it was a slightly different colour from the others, as if it had been placed more recently. Jimmy, help me with this. Together they carefully dismantled the cairn. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since deteriorated, was a metal box. Hamish's hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside, nestled in rotting fabric, were the artefacts Malcolm Campbell had tried to save. Celtic brooches green with age, old coins, and a small silver chalice that caught the weak sunlight and threw it back in defiant gleams. Evidence, Jimmy breathed. Actual physical evidence. More than that. Proof that Vane knew exactly what he was looking for. These are worth a small fortune to collectors, but to Mary... Hamish touched the chalice gently. These were her family's history, her father's last desperate attempt to save something from the wreckage, and Vane was going to expose Malcolm Campbell as a thief for hiding them from the creditors, destroying the only good memory Mary had left of her father. Hamish closed the box carefully. That's what pushed her over the edge. Not just the land being developed, but her father's name being destroyed forever. Jimmy pulled out his phone. I'll call the lab, get them to process this properly. But Hamish, this still doesn't prove she killed him. It proves motive, sure, but... I know. But it's enough to get Blair off Archie's back, and it's enough to start building a real case. Hamish stood, cradling the box. And it's enough to make Mary realise we're not giving up. They were halfway back to the village when Hamish's phone rang. It was the desk sergeant from Strathbane. Constable Macbeth, we've got a situation. Mrs. Mary Campbell has just walked into the station and asked to speak to DCI Blair. She says she has information about the Julian Vane murder. Hamish's stomach dropped. Don't let her say anything until I get there. Tell Blair to wait for me. He's already in with her now, sir. Been in there for 10 minutes. Hamish swore and hit the accelerator. Jimmy, call your desk. Tell them I'm on my way and Blair better not have mucked this up. What do you think she's doing? I think she's playing her final card. Getting ahead of the evidence, controlling the narrative. Hamish navigated the narrow Highland roads at speeds that would have given Blair an apoplexy. She's going to confess on her own terms, paint herself as the victim, and hope for jury sympathy. Will it work? In a Highland court, with the right jury? Probably. A woman driven to desperate action by historical wrongs, Defending her father's memory against a blackmailer? Hamish shook his head grimly. She might even get off with manslaughter. But when they burst into the Strathbane station 20 minutes later, they found Blair looking like Christmas had come early. Macbeth. Perfect timing. Mrs. Campbell has just made a full confession. Signed statement and everything, Blair was practically glowing with triumph. Turns out I was right all along about it being someone from the village. Solved the case through brilliant psychological pressure and superior detective work. Through the window of the interview room, Hamish could see Mary sitting calmly, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of serene composure. She caught his eye and smiled that gentle smile, and in that moment, Hamish understood. She'd won. Not the way she'd originally planned, but she'd won nonetheless. She'd controlled the confession, shaped the narrative, and now she'd face trial on her own terms. And Blair, the pompous fool, thought he'd crack the case through his own brilliance, which meant Blair would get the credit, the headlines, the glory, which meant Hamish Macbeth, having failed to solve the case himself, would be deemed too incompetent for promotion, which meant he could stay exactly where he was, in his beloved village of Lochdubh, avoiding advancement and keeping his peaceful life intact. Hamish caught Jimmy's eye and saw his own realization reflected there. Jimmy's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Well done, sir," Hamish said to Blair with absolute sincerity. "Brilliant work indeed," Blair preened. "Just doing my job, Macbeth. Unlike some people, I don't shirk my responsibilities." No, Hamish thought, as he watched Mary Campbell being led away to the cells. Some people just knew how to play a deeper game than others realised, and sometimes in the Highlands justice wore unexpected faces. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. 3 days after Mary Campbell's arrest, Hamish found himself sitting in the Heritage Centre with a cup of tea and a profound sense of unease. The new volunteer, Mrs. MacLeod from the next village over, was chattering about how shocking it all was, how you never could tell about people, how poor Mrs. Campbell had seemed so nice. Hamish made appropriately sympathetic noises and escaped as soon as politeness allowed. The village was in an uproar, split down the middle between those who thought Mary a monster and those who thought her a tragic victim driven to desperate action. The Curry sisters had stopped speaking to half their friends over the matter. Archie McLean, freed and vindicated, was holding forth in the pub about the incompetence of Strathbane police, conveniently forgetting his own near miss with a murder charge. And Blair was everywhere, giving interviews, accepting congratulations, basking in glory that was entirely undeserved. Hamish should have been furious. Instead, he felt oddly at peace. He drove to Strathbane that afternoon, and after some careful manipulation of visiting schedules, found himself alone with Mary Campbell in a sterile interview room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. She looked smaller in prison clothes, older, but no less composed. When she saw him, she smiled that gentle smile that he now knew hid such calculation. "Constable Macbeth, how kind of you to visit." "I needed to understand," Hamish said, sitting across from her. "Why you confessed. You could have fought it, made us prove every detail. Instead, you walked in and handed Blair the case on a silver platter." "Did I? I wonder." Mary folded her hands on the table. "I told the truth, that's all. About what Julian Vane did, about what his father did before him, about 40 years of waiting for justice that never came. You told it your way. Is there any other way to tell a story?" She tilted her head, studying him with those deceptively mild eyes. "You know what will happen now, don't you? I'll plead guilty to manslaughter, diminished responsibility due to psychological trauma from my father's suicide. My lawyer is already preparing the case. The jury will hear about Richard Vane's fraud, about my father hanging himself in that barn, about Julian threatening to destroy the only good memory I had left. You'll get a reduced sentence, perhaps even a suspended one. Given my age and clean record, community service most likely. Ironic that," she laughed softly, "returning to volunteer at the very heritage centre where I planned it all." Hamish felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. "You planned this from the beginning?" Not just the murder, but everything that came after. I planned for every contingency. If you hadn't figured it out, I would have remained the helpful widow forever. If you did figure it out, I would confess on my own terms, control the narrative, paint myself as the victim. Either way, I won. Her smile widened fractionally. You're not the only one who knows how to manipulate the system, Hamish Macbeth. Julian Vane was still a human being. However terrible his intentions, he didn't deserve to die. Didn't he? He was going to profit from his father's crime while destroying my father's memory. He was blackmailing half of Lochdoub. He cared for nothing but money and his own aggrandizement. Mary's voice remained calm, conversational. I didn't enjoy killing him, but I didn't regret it either. Some debts can only be paid in blood. That's not justice. No, it's vengeance. But sometimes, Constable, they're the same thing. She stood, signalling the end of the interview. You're free to judge me. But remember that you also make choices about which laws to enforce and which to overlook. We're not so different, you and I. We're nothing alike, Hamish said quietly, standing as well. No, you buried evidence of Dr. Brodie's poaching. You've overlooked Angus MacDonald's unlicensed fortune-telling for years. You let half the village get away with minor infractions because you value peace over strict adherence to the law. The only difference between us is degree, not kind. The guard came to take her back to her cell. At the door she paused. Thank you, by the way. For what? For not trying to save me from myself, for understanding that some things are worth the price. Her eyes held his. And for leaving the evidence where DCI Blair could find it so easily. That wool fibre in my weaving bag, the ledger right there on top. You made sure he got his glory, didn't you? Hamish said nothing, and Mary's smile acknowledged the silence as answer enough. We both got what we wanted, Hamish. I got my revenge, and you get to stay in Lochdoub, avoiding promotion, living your quiet life. Blair gets his headlines. Everyone's happy. She left. And Hamish stood alone in the interview room, her words echoing in his head like an accusation. That evening Jimmy Anderson arrived at the police station with a bottle of good whiskey and the air of a man bearing news. Blair's putting you forward for a commendation, he announced, pouring generous measures into 2 glasses. Hamish nearly choked on his drink. He's what? Putting you forward for official recognition of your work on the case. Says your diligent evidence-gathering was instrumental in securing the confession. Jimmy's grin was wicked. He's also recommended you for promotion. Says you're wasted in Lochdoub and should be transferred to Strathbane as a detective sergeant. The blood drained from Hamish's face. No, that can't happen. Relax. I had a word with Superintendent Daviot. Explained that while your evidence-gathering was exemplary, you failed to actually solve the case yourself. Blair cracked it through superior interrogation technique after all. You were just the support staff. And Daviot agreed that you're probably better suited to village policing. Good with the locals, conscientious about small matters, but lacking the killer instinct needed for serious detective work. Jimmy raised his glass in a mock toast. Congratulations, Hamish. You're officially too mediocre for advancement. Hamish sagged with relief. Thank God for that. Thought you'd be pleased. Though I have to say, watching you manipulate Blair into finding that evidence was a thing of beauty. The way you left that wool fibre right on top of Mary's bag, where even he couldn't miss it. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Just like you don't know that Mary Campbell played you like a fiddle from the beginning, and you let her because it suited your purposes. Jimmy's expression grew serious. She killed a man, Hamish, in cold blood. And she's going to get away with a little more than a slap on the wrist. She'll go to trial, face justice. On her own terms, with jury sympathy. She'll tell her sad story, and they'll practically give her a medal. Jimmy sipped his whiskey. Does that sit right with you? Hamish looked out the window at the village of Lochdoub, peaceful in the gathering dusk. Lights were coming on in cottage windows. Smoke rose from peat fires. Somewhere Lugs was barking at imaginary intruders. Yeah, and Sunsy was probably terrorising the local mouse population. No, he said honestly, but it's the best outcome we were going to get. Julian Vane is dead, and nothing will change that. Mary Campbell will face trial and likely conviction, even if the sentence is light. Archie's free. The village can heal, and I can stay here, keeping the peace in my own way. The lazy constable's justice? Someone's got to do it. They drank in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Outside, the standing stone stood eternal and indifferent, as they had for thousands of years, witness to all manner of human folly and tragedy. Later, after Jimmy had gone and the station was quiet, Hamish sat by the fire with lugs at his feet and Sonsie purring in his lap. He pulled out the photographs of the artefacts they'd found, the last remnants of Malcolm Campbell's desperate attempt to save his family's heritage. They'd been catalogued as evidence now, but after the trial they'd be returned to Mary's family, if she had any family left to claim them. Hamish thought about justice and vengeance, about the difference between the law and what was right, about the choices people made when pushed beyond endurance. Mary Campbell had been right about one thing. They weren't so different, he and she. Both of them had learned to work within a flawed system, bending the rules when necessary to achieve what they thought was right. The only difference was that Hamish bent the rules to preserve peace, while Mary had broken them to pursue revenge. In the end, perhaps that was difference enough. He fed the photographs into the peat fire and watched them burn. The images of Celtic brooches and silver chalices consumed by flame. Some stories, he thought, were better left unfinished. Some secrets were better left buried. And some Highland constables were better left exactly where they were, in small villages where they could do the most good in their own peculiar way. Hamish Macbeth was going nowhere, and he couldn't have been happier about it.